For the last couple of days now, I've been playing with this Dillon RL300, and I've been loading up some 30-30 Winchester. Now, if you saw the first video, I talked about how that you have the priming decapping station, which would be right in the front, and then as it rotates counterclockwise, you got the powder. If you were going to be doing straight wall casing, the powder through funnel would flare the mouth and drop the powder charge at the same time, just as it would on your 550s, 650s, and the rest of the presses like that. Now I cleaned up a bunch of 30-30 casings, and it was a new product that I hadn't been using before, so I wanted to check this stuff out. So I did, and it works really quite well. Although it does leave the casings a little bit oily. So I decided, because I'm not going to use the Dillon primer feed mechanism that attaches right here for the press, because there's some things going on with it that I haven't fiddled with enough to figure out what the deal is with it yet. I'm just going to use my K&M hand priming tool. And so, because I did not want that oil on my fingers as I'm going to be handling primers out of my primer flip tray, I cleaned a bunch of casings, used this stuff, resized and decapped them all, and it worked great. And then what I did was I threw my brass back into the vibratory tumbler to get the excess oil off of there. Now I've got a trough full of brass that I can load up. Now I did yesterday load up some of the 160 grain. I've got some older boxes of Spear 30 caliber 165 170 grain bullets that I'm going to load for this 30-30 using Accurate Arms 4064. So it's degreased, the brass is clean and ready to go, but because of the way this works, let me go through this with you here. So I grab a casing, grab a primer, and I'm going to prime these by hand. Now I insert into station number 1. I rotate it around and I raise the platform and I push the plunger, and that drops the powder charge through the powder funnel into the casing. I bring it back around to the front, pull it out. I've got a Lyman M5 scale, an older scale that works beautifully, by the way. I love these old scales. Now I got this set up right now to drop 28.3 grains of powder, and this is, I usually set these things up to drop just a couple of tenths under, then I'll trickle up to exactly the correct amount, and I'm 1/10 under right now. Now if I wanted to, frankly, I don't shoot well enough to figure out the difference in elevation, that the velocity difference from 1/10 of 1 grain of Accurate Arms 4064 would make, but I'm going to be persnickety, and I'm going to make sure every powder charge is spot on exactly the same. So I dump this into the casing. Now before I come over here to seat the projectile, I have set up on the Redding T7 next door here a Lee Universal Expander. And the reason I've got that set up is these 170 grain Spear projectiles, the flat nose soft point, are a flat base bullet. So I run this up into here to open up the mouth of the casing just a tiny bit. Just enough so I can set the projectile on top, take my fingers away, and it'll stay put. Because if I didn't do that, it would not hold the projectile for me and allow me to take my fingers away. So I'm just making life a little bit easier for me. Now I insert it back into station number 1 where my seating die is. Now initially, remember I said this is the sizing decapping station, and you can reprime right there. And so in your second station, as you rotate it counterclockwise, drop your powder charge on a straight wall, you'd flare the mouth at the same time. And then back here, you would seat the bullet and rotate it around here to the fourth station, where you would crimp the bullet. Now, to reach around like this and to seat a bullet, to me, it's just not something I want to do. And because I wanted to degrease these casings before I went and loaded them up anyway. I resized and decapped in station number one, and when I threw my brass in the vibratory tumbler to take off all the excess oil, I pulled the sizing decapping die out of station number one and moved the seating die right here in front. Now I have this set up just to seat to an OAL that the book tells me 2.550, and which is right in front, which is easy to get at. And then I can rotate it to the left where I've got a Lee crimp die set up, and it's the collet style die rather than taper. So on a projectile like this, when you run that up into the casing, the collets on the outside of the mouth of the casing and the projectile will squeeze down to provide bite in that direction, rather than like if you had a taper where you run a case up and it's running into a taper like that. This is just because of the ogive and the configuration of the projectile. This, for me, was just a better way to go. So I run this up, not quite all the way, give it a quarter turn, run it up again, and then I'm going to rotate it to the left. I run it up into my crimp die, and if I wanted to, I can do a quarter turn on that for the concentricity, but I don't really think that's necessary to turn it when you're using a collet style crimp die to get it as concentric as possible, because it kind of is a concentric deal, because you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 little sections in there that kind of squeeze together on the mouth of the casing. Now from here, I can rotate it around and I pull it off of the backside and I set that into my load block right there. Is that convoluted enough? So let's do this one more time. This isn't something, if you're brand new trying to figure out how to make ammunition, probably not the best way for you to go about doing this. But after you've made a million of them, this is actually going to add an element of interest to the process to just figure out what's the best way to do what it is that I'm doing here with what I happen to have, this RL300, which is the rarest of all the Dillon progressive machines. They made less than 1,000 of these bad boys, and because they lost money on them, they didn't make very many, less than 1,000. And then they said, you know what, enough's enough. So I just primed a casing with my K&M tool. I'm going to run over here. Now the order that I'm flaring the mouth is not really important. I'm just making sure that I do it. Station number one, rotate it to the right, run it all the way up, push my plunger, back this off. Now because I want to make sure every single powder charge is exactly the same, dump that into the pan of my Lyman M5. It's an O-House scale. And again, that's about 2/10 of a grain under. And I deliberately set it up again so I can trickle back up. So I'm back up there, spot on. Dump my powder. This is a shortcut extrusion. If you're not familiar with accurate 4064, I mean, it meters reasonably decent, better than like longer extrusions would. But next, I think I'm going to load something with ball powder, something with a finer granulation, just to see how consistently this old dispenser actually dispenses. So I place a projectile on there, run it up most of the way, turn it a quarter turn, run it up again, rotate it over to the left, crimp the projectile, rotate it over off the back, pull it off. That is going to make a pre-64 Winchester Model 94 very, very happy. Might make some jackrabbits unhappy, but it'll be over before they knew it happened. Anyway, just having some fun. Thanks for hanging out with me. Happy trails. That was spot on. Sometimes you get lucky. Stop right there.